If a woman wrote American Psycho, would a publisher publish it as a daring feminist statement about toxic masculinity? Perhaps.
I'm delighted to have lured you onto Times Radio as a very long time fan of yours. You've said that you're welcome. You've said that you've been thinking of writing the Shards for 20 years, though I suspect it might actually be even longer. But let's just go in on the 20 years. Why did it take you that long to pick up the pen? You've talked about it as being particularly a traumatic period to revisit.
Well, I will actually tell you, it's been 40 years.
Yes, you
40
see, I
years
thought it was longer, yeah.
Since I wanted to write this book, and since I first thought this book up, which was in my senior year in high school, when I was 17 and 18 years old, and a series of events happened that were the catalyst that moved me from being an adolescent into adulthood. It happens at different times with different people's lives, but for me, that was the year. And I wanted to write about it. And I was working on a novel called Less Than Zero, which was my first novel. I've been working on that novel since I was about 16, 17. And then a series of things happened to me that made me want to write the Shards. But I also didn't feel at that point that I quite had the chops or the experience or the talent to even attempt it. And Less Than Zero seemed to be what I like to call a vibe novel, a hangout novel. It moves from scene to scene. It describes a world, but it really isn't dependent upon characterization, storyline, narrative. I could write that novel at 18 or 19. The Shards, when I imagined it, was just too big, too vast. And so over the years, I always thought I'd go back to the Shards after I finished each book I published, it through the 80s into the 90s, even into the early 2000s. And then I thought, it's never going to happen. And then, and maybe it doesn't matter. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe I just don't know how to do this book. And then sometime during lockdown, during the pandemic, there was nothing to do. All my movie projects had dried up. There was no one out. LA was a ghost town. We didn't leave our apartment. And I started going online, which is something I rarely ever do anymore. And I started looking up old classmates because I was listening to music from that period, from 1981, Blondie, Duran Duran, all the music of that decade. And it made me want to look at my classmates, some of the classmates that I hurt and I betrayed in my drama queen moment as a writer, as a burgeoning writer. My imagination ran wild. I was a liar basically a lot of the time. I lied. I made up gossip. I couldn't control my superpower. You know how they do that in superhero movies? You've got to learn how to control that superpower.
So was Less Than Zero the catalyst for the hurting of your schoolmates, or was it other things that you wrote at that time?
Less Than Zero was the avoidance. Less Than Zero was just about the world. But so I finally, something, and this is how every novel happens. You feel something. It's not an over-intellectualized process. You don't overthink it. I start feeling stuff. I start getting emotional. And through that emotion, a novel begins to emerge. And I was feeling all of these things suddenly. And I think the reason The Shards was written when it was written was because I was finally the right age. I was 56, 57. Those stirrings of nostalgia were very strong. Much stronger then than they were 10 years previous, 15 years previous. And they really kind of became overwhelming. And I realized, I think I have to write this book now.
It's quite interesting to see the contrast between you looking back on the events that your readers will previously have only had access to, in Less Than Zero. You're looking back on those events through a nostalgic lens rather than perhaps the arch cynicism or satirism that with which you portrayed the same things in Less Than Zero.
We all grow up. We all grow up, don't we? I mean, that cool young man that I thought I was, who kind of thought being disaffected by things was an attractive pose. I'm not that man anymore. I'm not the man who wrote Less Than Zero anymore, just as I'm not the man who wrote American Psycho. I'm not the man who wrote my other novels. You really do change, I feel. It sounds so whatever banal. You change as you get older, and my books are reflections of the changes that I'm going through. And so, of course, the Shards is a very different book from Less Than Zero. I guess in a way that you might be right. I mean, the Shards is kind of a precursor to Less Than Zero and a reason why Less Than Zero happened, and was something that kind of followed the Shards in a way. So if you were reading my books, I guess you would start with the Shards if you wanted to read them in chronological order.
Yes, that's
My last
exactly.
book would be my first book.
That's exactly what I felt embarking on it. Can you describe for our listeners what you see the book as being about? Because actually, in a way, you know, it's seeped in some kind of nostalgia. It is about early 80s Los Angeles, 1981 to be precise, but it's also a kind of genre murder mystery, which you've sort of lavished on us, along with what would, I suppose, in another writer's hands, be an attempt at a memoir.
It's also, in many ways, a high school teen drama. And everything spreads out from there. It's about a group of friends at a high school in 1981. Some of them are the archetypes of that period. There's the gorgeous football player who's the quarterback, his beautiful homecoming homecoming queen, prom queen girlfriend, who is very close friends with the narrator of the book. The narrator of the book is Bret Ellis. He's me. He's a burgeoning young writer. He's a closeted gay kid who is trying to fit into the high school atmosphere. He is dating one of the most popular girls in the school, whose father is a famous producer. And he is part of the popular clique, not because he's popular, but because he has moved himself into this clique by, I don't know, perhaps being a bit of an actor. And so really for me, when I began to write the book, I wanted to write about the high school kids, their dramas. A lot of it is about sex, I have to say. And I've been taken to task for writing about all of these underage sex scenes, both straight and gay, because Bret also has a couple of closeted boyfriends on the side. And then within this group, a new kid arrives, a kid named Robert Mallory, who is drop dead gorgeous, who is so compelling, so charismatic, that Bret begins to realize that this group, this sort of facade that he has helped created to kind of get him through this senior year of high school, is going to crack because of this boy. There's also a serial killer haunting LA called the Trawler. And Bret imagines a timeline between Robert Mallory, the new kid, and the Trawler murders. And he begins to see a connection between them. And there are some connections between them. And so the mystery of the novel is really about who is the Trawler, who is murdering these girls, and are one of these girls that is in Bret's core friend group going to be next?
You mentioned there about the sex scenes and underage and so on and so forth. I mean, as I've said, this is, as I understand it, a memoir to some extent. It's a fictionalized memoir. So what you're writing about are things that actually happened.
Yes.
Indulge me here. What do you feel about the then insinuation that you should draw a cloak of invisibility over things that have actually happened because they appear unpalatable to people's sensibilities, which is, I think, very much what's happening with the sex in your book, for example?
I don't care. I didn't write it for them.
Who's them?
The reader, my publisher, my agent, the people making money off my book. I didn't write it for anybody. There's a dedication at the beginning of the Shards. You know what it says? For no one. For no one. This is the disconnect about being a writer. When I'm writing a book, I am not in a contractual position with a publisher. I do not make a 3-book deal with a publisher. I don't even take advances from a publisher. I haven't published a novel in 13 years. I write because I want to write the damn book. I'm feeling something. Finally, this book arrived, and it was a joy to write. Writing for me is a hobby. It has never been a career. It is a hobby of mine, and I really enjoy it when it happens. And writing the Shards for a year and a half was sheer bliss. I loved going into that office every morning. I loved writing about these characters. I loved going into my past. I loved romanticizing to a degree 3 or 4 of my friends that I was very close to, a couple that I feel I betrayed at some point. So all of that is joy. And then there's the rest of it. There's the reactions, there's the criticism, there's the 1-star review. There's also the 5-star review. I'm very divided, as everyone will know.
Divisive. Yeah.
Divisive.
Polarizing,
So
but so's the world.
That's my feeling. And also, by the way, I don't believe a book can have too much sex.
I think you'll probably have quite a few people who'll agree with you on that. But the interesting thing about you is that a lot of people, and certainly writers, mellow as they get older. And in some ways, we've been talking about the nostalgia with which this period in the 80s is cloaked to an extent, although there's also lots of sex and murder. But you don't seem to have mellowed. And in fact, you seem to be one of the few people actively challenging, though I would say it's becoming more of a chorus, the assumption that writers, I mean, you've done it, haven't you? You've written about what you know, but what you know is considered offensive and cancelable in some areas.
And I have been canceled. I think people tend to forget that in 1991, 30 of my publishers dropped me around the world through American Psycho when the controversy began. 30. That's all of my publishers but one. So I was a free agent suddenly. I guess I was one of the first of the canceled. I don't know. And certainly that essay collection, that essay White that I published about 4 years ago, got me into a lot of trouble in Hollywood. I lost some jobs because of that book, because I was trying to understand the appeal of Trump. But even if you were doing that, you were a traitor. You shouldn't be doing that. Why are you trying to understand this? Well, anyway, so I've gone through this in my life. You have to sleep at night. I can't fake it. I can't pretend to be something that I'm not. And also, I have to tell you, I do think I have softened in many ways. I have become much more pragmatic about my life, and I am able to divide my real life from my writing life. They don't completely overlap. And I have the same problems as everybody else. I have a boyfriend with addiction issues. I have aging parents that I'm concerned about. I have a sister who has been in and out of hospitals. So and also the plumbing in my apartment needs to be replaced, and it's a frigging Kafka-esque nightmare. So if you want to know the truth, I'm thinking about those 4 things on this book tour. You know what? I really am. And then I'm doing interviews, and then I'm doing appearances. But at 57, 58, real life begins to really become important.
And why was it
like it wasn't important before? Important in different ways.
But do you think that that's the reason that you've become quite resilient and are prepared to challenge the sort of perceived norms of the moment? And do you think it's possible to be a writer only writing about what you know? Because that seems to be the assumption in a lot of quarters, that that's what you should be doing.
I've only written about what I know. I've always written about what I know. That's just how I operate. I don't do gobs and gobs of research and say, well, I think I'm going to write a novel about 18th century Russia. Let's go do that. Again, we have to get back to that notion of feeling a book. It's an emotional thing. It isn't an intellectual exercise. So if I'm feeling something, confusion, pain, whatever it might have been throughout my life, unrequited love, my problematic alcoholic father, whatever it might be, they start, these emotions and these feelings start happening, and then a book emerges from those. So I am writing what I know. Someone asked me, why haven't you read a memoir? Why haven't you ever just flat out write a memoir? I think a lot of people would be interested in a memoir about a young writer who suddenly has a success and what that does to him. Why don't you write that memoir? And I've told this person, I've written 9 volumes of a memoir. They're all out there. They're all published. Every single book in some ways is a story about where I was at a certain point in my life.
And Shards is almost a sort of 1980s fever dream, full of pop cultural references, band songs, films compulsively listed. Yes. I love the idea of you having just passed your test and driving around in a Mercedes. I mean, you guys were so overprivileged in so many ways. But I know that you've spent the last, I don't know, is it 12, 13, 14 years actually pursuing, and it reads like an amazing box set that I'd like to deeply immerse myself in. And yet you've spent the last sort of 13 years or so attempting to do the screen thing and the screenwriting. And actually, that's why it's been so long since you've written a novel. What was it that sort of prevented you or has stood in the way of you embarking on that new avenue, do you think?
I always wanted to be a filmmaker. I grew up in Hollywood. I grew up in a school where a lot of people got into movies and TV. We grew up in the movie mad 70s, the golden age of cinema for some. And we all wanted to make movies. We grew up in LA. We saw every movie that came out. We all wanted to make movies. Many of us became screenwriters, a few of us directors, producers, etc. Everyone got into the business. And I thought I was going to become a filmmaker. And but yet I was also writing on the side. I was writing books. I'd written 2 books previous to Less Than Zero. So that form, the novel, always interested me. And Less Than Zero, was published at 21, and it kind of derailed my entrance into Hollywood, which I thought I'd do after I graduated from university. But no, I had a number of other books I wanted to write. And so when I was finally done with the last book I wanted to write, which was a novel called Lunar Park from 2005, I thought, okay, I'm going to move back to LA. A series of events had happened. My partner had died suddenly of 7 years. His ghost was everywhere. It was time to leave New York. The party had ended. I went to LA. I sold a show to HBO. I was paid a lot of money to put together a movie adaptation of my short story collection, The Informers. It all was looking good. That first 1 year looked really good. And then it was a disaster, and I wrote about it in a novel called Imperial Bedrooms, my Hollywood horror novel. And then I really began to believe that the miniseries was the new novel. The TV show was the new novel. I had a bunch of scripts that everyone was interested in that never got made. I was very well paid for these 10 or 12 years lost in what I call the casino. Hollywood is the casino. You never win. You never win. And it's too bad, because those 15 years or so are really the prime years for writers, their 40s and 50s. That's really when they're at the height of their powers. And I miss out on those. Who knows what novel I could have come up with instead of 20,000 pages of scripts that never got made. And there came a time when I said, I can't do this anymore. I just simply can't do this anymore. I have to go back to prose writing. And it kind of began with White, with that essay that I published that caused so much consternation in 2019. And a lot of that was from my podcast, from my weekly podcast. I took a lot of those essays from my monologues that I opened the podcast with, and I rewrote them. And I realized, screenwriting is not prose writing. You're not writing well when you're writing scripts. But I noticed that, I was prose writing again. And I do think that there was something about putting that book together in 2018, when I was beginning to feel everything collapsing in Hollywood, that maybe it is time for another book. And maybe that's when the Shards slowly began to announce itself in 2019. And then into 2020, I began writing it. But I made the classic mistake. And what's so sad about it is that I grew up in Hollywood. I knew all the warning signs. I saw most of my friends' parents worked in Hollywood and were miserable and well compensated, but never got their movies made, et cetera, et cetera.
When White came out, you dared to challenge the notion that liberal good trump bad, and it being that simple. In fact, you argue in that book that sort of liberal outrage and liberal overreaction is stifling discourse, and you've described liberals online as authoritarian language police. Do you still feel that, or is this in itself a sort of an overreaction to a small minority online, so you're just throwing your hat in with the rest of them?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's worse than ever, by the way, and I think that as an artist, to have to walk on eggshells and to be told by a publisher that you cannot write in the voice of a woman, no one's going to publish that right now, or you can't step into the shoes of, I don't know, whatever you want to write about, a handicapped Latino, a little Ethiopian girl, let's say, or a lesbian woman in her mid-40s. That I will not be able to be published by a mainstream publisher if I want to do something like that, because of identity politics, which are a truly dreadful thing for the arts. I'm not talking about outside in the world or whatever. I'm talking about within the arts, that an actor now cannot play a role because they are not that role. That's nuts, man. And that's Hollywood. And, you know, all this progressivism that Hollywood is so proud of itself about, and how woke it thinks it is actually a kind of reverse racism and a reverse progressivism and a reverse kind of wokeness. It is a kind of authoritarian conservatism that goes back to the 50s in terms of how strict their ideology is. And these almost authoritarian, well, not almost authoritarian beliefs in things that aren't human. People are messes. People are contradictions. People are filled of hypocrisies and craziness and whatever. And you really cannot set up a list of rules to completely control that. I don't advocate violence and I don't advocate hate speech or anything like that. But we've got to be realistic about the flaws that all of us have. And, you know, and I feel that there was a point, and maybe there still is a point, where there was punishment being doled out for offenses that didn't warrant them. And they came from the left, simply did. And I really hated that, because I always saw myself as a left-leaning liberal gay man. And I still did to a degree, but I realized that the political scene had gone to such a point where I, not changing my mind about anything, had been pushed all the way over to this side because I refused to align myself with some of the lunacy of the left.
Do you think American Psycho would even be published now?
Well, I think if a woman wrote it, perhaps, yeah. But probably not. Well, that's a good question. If a woman wrote American Psycho, would a publisher publish it as a daring feminist statement about toxic masculinity? Perhaps, but even thinking about it in that way is sort of chilling. I think American Psycho is still, even if a woman wrote it, too extreme for the new mainstream publishers. I do think maybe an independent, and by the way, I mean, not to sound overly alarmist, there are a lot of independent publishers out there who do publish stuff that does not conform to the notions of the big three publishers. I mean, at least that we have in the United States. So maybe there's chance, there's a shot, and there's always places to, you know, online explore fiction and new modes of expression.
Haven't you made it your business with this book, at least in the UK, to publish with a publisher that actually relishes, embraces, makes it their business to publish those who've been cancelled or, you know, had attempted cancellations?
I have to tell you honestly, as if I haven't been honest with you during these last 30 minutes, which I
well,
have.
you told me you were a liar when you were a teenager, so I'm just wondering how much you've changed.
Yes, I have changed a lot since then. Well, you know, I've been at Picador my publisher since I was 21. Sonny Maida, the great Sonny Maida, who was the head of Picador then, published Less Than Zero in 21 when many other British publishers didn't want to touch the drug-addled journal of a teenager. Sonny saw literary merit in it and saw a future for me. So I was at Picador for my entire career, for all of my books. Now, I don't really get into the business of things, but I hear that Picador had changed a lot. A lot of people had left that I knew, a lot of editors that I liked. In fact, I had dinner with one last night, and they say it has changed. And I also heard that they did not want to publish me or my new book. And they gave us a very lowball offer to my agent and my agent said, I don't think they want you. And I don't think you're the type of writer that they want to publish or have on their list. So, let's take a risk. Let's go with Swift. Let's partner with Swift. And, you're not going to take an advance. You're actually going to work together to sell the book. And then you will each take place, you will each be profit participants in it from book one, instead of taking that fat advance that never pays out, and let's see how this business model works. My agent really does think that in the future, this is going to be how authors and publishers work together, instead of this outmoded way where 80% of books just don't make their money back because of the advances. So
Swift do have a mission, don't they? Swift do have a mission as well, don't they?
I guess that there's a mission here. I don't like to get into the business side of it. I really leave that up to them. But and it is a risk. It is a risk. We don't know if this is fully going to work out. But if you're not in a position where you can afford to take a risk, I think you should. So that's where we are. But I must say, and I am sad that I am no longer with Picador. And though all of my books are in print there, everything that I've written is still in print, but it's too bad it worked out this way.
And do you think it's got anything to do with the fact that you do share your opinions vociferously?
I think look, I think being a middle-aged white man in this current entertainment culture is not as desirable as it once was. So you're perhaps just not as popular as you once were, and so I think that might be the reason. I'm not sure.
Can we go back to the Shards and just talk about, the thing that I'm so enjoying at the moment.
Just hold on. I'm sorry. Hello. Okay, I'll be right down. Okay, thank you. I have a 12 o'clock interview I forgot about. Okay, Ruth, I'm just finishing up here with the radio, and I'll be down as soon as possible. Okay, thank you. What? Okay, bye-bye.
Very last question then.
Okay.
Just finally, let's go back to the Shards and just talk a little bit to me about that period that you described so deliciously here. It was actually the first time that I went to Los Angeles. It would have been probably almost that year, I think. And so, there's so much here that's resonant for me of that time. But there's also this incredible sense, and in a way, because you're not being sharp about it, the idea of these young people, as you all were at high school, driving like BMWs and Mercedes and popping Quaaludes and snorting cocaine and kind of being absolutely preoccupied with your own lives, with your own pleasures. It felt sort of deliciously debauched in a way that I wonder, you talk about celebrating the freedom of that period and the fact that you were all very, very free. But I wonder if the freedom didn't come from, I'm making this way too convoluted, but that in some ways young people just don't have the opportunity to be free like that, and certainly not without the privilege.
Well, the privilege, I think it was more than privilege. I think there was just an overall freedom in society and in the world. And the drug taking, for example, in the Shards is pretty minimal. There's not a lot of it. The drugs didn't really up themselves until Less Than Zero era, which is a 2 or 3 years past that. I think the freedom that we felt is that there were ideology had not come into our lives. Wokeness had not come to our lives. Nothing was racist or sexist. And, artists we liked all artists. We loved Prince. We loved David Bowie. There was just this sense that you could say anything, and we were looking to be shocked and offended. We wanted to be confronted by art. I remember books and films were windows, not mirrors. I didn't want to see myself reflected. I wanted to see other people's experiences. And I also think the other thing was that this freedom, this world that we lived in, was a world completely created by and for adults. There was no child kind of system at play, where we now do live in a child-proofed world where everyone is wondering, what do the kids want? They need the medication. They need this entertainment. There were no 42-year-old men dressed up as a Marvel hero going to Comic-Con for a month. We wanted to be adults. We wanted to enter into the world of sex and a career. And that's really why I guess we seem so much more adult than kids today. And I kind of do connect that with freedom of just, not living under an ideology that I do think keep people children.
Bret Easton Ellis, always a delight to talk to you, and it certainly was today. Thank you very much indeed.